Hello and welcome back into the studio with me, your host Josh Yen, and today we're joined once again by Dr. Aaron Simmons to talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I was almost going to say Dietrich Bonhoeffer, how are you? But we have Aaron Simmons, how are you?
I'm good, though I would love to be in any sentence compared with him as a thinker and a man of integrity. I do hope that I do not get hung by Nazis, and so yes, I'll stay Aaron Simmons tonight and do my best to sing the praises of Bonhoeffer.
Yes, indeed. We're going to be talking about loads of different questions, ranging from who was Bonhoeffer, some personal reflections we have on Bonhoeffer and his theological works, and his relationship with, of course, as you alluded to, Nazi Germany and his influence there. So I can't wait to get into this interview with you, Aaron. So first of all, to get started, who was Bonhoeffer?
Yeah, so as I mentioned to you before we got rolling, I am a philosopher of religion. My specialty is actually existential and phenomenological philosophy of religion. And so when I approach Bonhoeffer's work, I tend to do so explicitly as a philosopher of religion. Now, that said, and this is relevant probably to the audience that watches a lot of your videos that kind of run that intersection of philosophy and theology, I also identify as a Pentecostal Christian. I'm an open theist, postmodern Pentecostal. And so given these two sides of sort of how I navigate my own thinking and my own living, Bonhoeffer is hands down the most influential theologian on my own work. And also, I would suggest even on my own life. He's the guy that helps me think better about what I hope Christianity is and how it functions. But all of that's filtered through this kind of philosophical lens. And so I say that for two reasons. One, lots of Bonhoeffer scholars are either ethicists in a kind of Christian ethics sense, or they are theologians. And I am neither of those things. I study philosophical ethics and I study theological claims from the philosophical perspective. And so it's important that folks not, again, expect me to be doing this other stuff. And then secondly, I am not a historian. And so though I have a couple degrees in history, there are some amazing historians reading Bonhoeffer, digging into his life and his context and his times in ways that I'm not going to do. And so my take on him tonight is very much a kind of, philosopher reading Bonhoeffer and then trying my best to put that into practice in my own Christian life. And so with that as the kind of caveat, Bonhoeffer is a German theologian born in 1906. His work, I guess the best way to think about it, again, as a philosopher, is he starts by really trying to think through what does it mean to live a Christian life. And so one of his early books called The Cost of Discipleship, probably his most famous book, is all about trying to cash out this lived experience that is, reflective Christian existence. But Bonhoeffer also speaks a lot about the community or the life of the church. And so actually in his dissertation, Centorum Communio, he thinks about what does it mean to live together in this space defined by not just cognitive assent to who God is as revealed in Christ, but in a much deeper sense, a kind of, lived, engaged relational space. And one of my other favorite books by Bonhoeffer actually takes that up and then kind of makes it a little bit more popularly accessible, a book called Life Together. And so if we think about Bonhoeffer as deeply influenced by this Christocentric theology of someone like Karl Barth, but appropriating some of the best existential philosophy that we find in people like Martin Heidegger and even some in the theology of Tillich, we then get this thinker who in many ways was a kind of, I would suggest, a Christological purist about, here is what it looks like to live Christianly and to live on purpose as a Christian in light of this vision of God as revealed in Christ. But then something happens. Bonhoeffer ends up spending some time in New York City at Union Theological Seminary. While there, two things really importantly happened. One, he befriends one of the first Black students at Union Theological Seminary and goes to Abyssinian Baptist Church with him, his home church, which has this long legacy in the Black church of being very socially active, thinking about Christian living as a practice of social engagement. At the same time, Bonhoeffer is working with Reinhold Niebuhr, who is not only kind of the father of Christian social ethics, but also develops a view that is simply called Christian realism. And what that looks like is the idea that even though we might be called to live to a very, very high, threshold of what Christ would expect of us, what God would demand, we live in the world. And so this radical recognition that the eschaton, or the kingdom of God, is not now present, and yet we should live toward that expectation, that requires us doing the best we can with what we've got where we are, rather than a kind of deep perfectionist commitment where I must right now live exactly like I would live if the eschaton were in my current situation, right? So if you take Niebuhr, this, hey, think about Christianity as a lived praxis, engaging your world and the problems that we encounter as a world, coupled with his experiences at Abyssinian Baptist Church, watching the struggle of African Americans in the United States context, wrestling through historical marginalization and oppression and exclusion, and yet having what we would now call a kind of Black liberationist thread in their theological practice. These two things come together in Bonhoeffer, and over time begin to really show up more in his later work. So Bonhoeffer goes back to Germany. As we all know, things are getting really complicated in Germany. They're in the 30s. And he ends up basically on the side of those minority group pastors, very, very frustrated by the rise of Hitler and the rise of Hitlerism and Nazism. And part of what is really central in that development, this sort of resistance to the rise and Nazification of Germany, is, well, two things. One, the Nazis and Hitler continue to move into this space where war is almost inevitable. And Bonhoeffer sees that as deeply, deeply problematic, given his earlier pacifistic commitments that what God calls us to is a life of peace. But secondly, Bonhoeffer is one of the early ones also seeing the radical anti-Semitism that was tragically and evilly too culturally present already. And this can even be traced in some cultural ways back to some of Luther's own influence on the Christian tradition within the context of German Lutheranism more broadly. That anti-Semitism now started showing up in exceptionally public ways. So anti-Semitism and this kind of militaristic drive to war are the two reasons that Bonhoeffer really is resisting this Nazification and the rise of National Socialism. Well, there is this group of pastors, again, who kind of break off. They engage in a declaration that is largely drafted by Karl Barth. And it basically says, we're not down with this. This is antithetical to who God is. This is against our Christian commitments. And so they break off and form what's called the Confessing Church. And the Confessing Church leads to an illegal seminary that Bonhoeffer is basically one of the professors kind of running. And this is occurring in a time where, young ministers wanting to get trained into the pastorate. Well, what do you do if all the official and licensed seminaries are training you into a kind of explicitly Nazi adjacent version of Christian life? Well, the only alternative is this Confessing Church seminary that Bonhoeffer was part of. And what ends up happening is this group of students become very, very active in a kind of resistance movement. And they realize that this is part of what it looks like to simply live the Christian faith that Bonhoeffer was teaching them about. And you can starting to notice this Niebuhrian influence showing back up, right? And Bonhoeffer explicitly connects his experiences of thinking through and seeing the life of African-American Christians in the States, having navigated this legacy of white supremacy, And he starts making these analogies to anti-Semitism and the life for Jewish Germans that were now trying to navigate the oppression and exclusion experienced under the Nazi rule, right? So all of this is going on at this illegal seminary. Well, skip ahead a little bit. Bonhoeffer eventually, along with his brother-in-law, his brother, and a few other relatives and friends, become part of a very expansive resistance movement. And this expansive resistance movement eventually leads to Bonhoeffer being a kind of double agent of sorts. So he's ostensibly working as a kind of propagandist for the Nazis, going to all of these European places, talking to European pastors and British, bishops and things, and doing all of this as a way of kind of spreading this Nazi German Christian idea. But what he's actually doing is out there trying to garner support for the resistance, creating this kind of network of friends and allies that are all standing together under the auspices of this confessing church movement to resist what they see as genuinely anti-Christian behavior, and not just anti-Christian, but anti-human behavior. So this leads to a variety of assassination attempts on Hitler's life, which you might say, predictably, any person of good faith would kind of engage in these, activities. But for Bonhoeffer, again, cost of discipleship was all about radical discipleship to the kingdom of God vision of moral life, radical pacifism. And in fact, Bonhoeffer had gotten invited to go work with Gandhi. Various things got in the way of being able to do that because of the war effort and stuff. And so this sort of assassination attempt is really, these things are kind of starting to really bubble up. Meanwhile, the war, of course, has not fully launched. Bonhoeffer decides to try to escape Germany to, basically be as much help as he can, goes back to Union Theological Seminary, very quickly realizes, I can't be part of the healing after Hitler if I'm not there during the suffering occurring, while he's in charge. Takes literally the last boat back to Germany before the war starts. And then, it's kind of like the fate is sealed. All of these men are now working to get rid of Hitler in the name of what they think is what God would demand of them, to love their neighbor. And yet it's requiring them to violate what they take to be the fundamental Christian moral commitment, which is pacifism. Be peaceful, be peacemakers. So that tension, how do we both know what we should be doing in light of what God calls us to, and yet doing that now, being peaceful now, is to violate God's will for us to stand for the oppressed, for the marginalized, for those who are being victimized by hatred and inhumanity. And so that tension animates Bonhoeffer's later work, the book he saw as kind of his magnum opus, a book called Ethics. And then this leads to, again, a series of assassination attempts in almost tragic ways. All of these fail, right? So they have a plane, a bomb on a plane. It fails to go off, and it would have destroyed the plane and killed Hitler. Famously, they have a this is actually recorded in the Tom Cruise movie Valkyrie. If anybody's seen that film, this is all part of that group of people trying to get rid of Hitler, where one of the folks in this group takes a briefcase with a bomb, takes it into a room with Hitler, gets right next to Hitler, places the bomb, manages to excuse himself. Well, in the commotion, somehow the briefcase gets kicked too far away. When it explodes, all of the explosion, the explosive power doesn't go off. And the table that it was under was so heavy, it protected Hitler from some of the blast, right? So it's like this, man, they were doing so much to try to stop this madness. Every single time, something seemed to get in the way. Along the way, Bonhoeffer and his co-conspirators all get captured. They get locked up. He spends quite a while in a German prison. And then after that final attempt to kill Hitler, where the bomb gets messed up by the table, now Hitler's mad and basically more or less sentences them all to death. Bonhoeffer gets moved to a concentration camp in a very quick trial where records suggest that he didn't even defend himself. He gets sentenced to death. And then in April 1945, basically right at the end of the war, he ends up taken naked to the gallows and hung to death as a martyr for both Christianity and also, we might say, just humanistic ethics, right? The idea that other people matter. And famously, at his death, he is asked, "Do you have any final words?" And he says, "This is the end. For me, it is but the beginning." And so we get this sort of recorded final statement where in all his letters and papers from prison, which eventually get published and edited together, they're some of my favorite works by Bonhoeffer. We see him as a man absolutely refusing to claim moral certainty. There's a lot of, God forgive me. I pray that God, walk with me. I'm trying my best to do the best I can. But we also see him absolutely shift from this kind of earlier sense of here is the duty that we have as Christians. It shifts to what then is God's will for me now, given my circumstances. And that radical, I would, as a postmodernist, call this a kind of contextual ambiguity that gets sort of brought into his ethical convictions. We never see him flinch when it comes to what it means to stand in the world for Christ and to stand as, like with a God in the world. But what we do see is this pivot from a kind of purist vision of Christian ethics to a much more Nieberian conception where what it is we do is the best we can with what we've got. And so where I find Bonhoeffer just absolutely thrilling as a philosopher and also a Christian myself is he fights against the complacency that would accompany being part of something called the church as a political entity. And he instead calls us, I would suggest, like Kierkegaard, to bring Christianity to Christendom, as Martin Luther King does, to kind of bring the beloved community, face to face with the white moderates opposing racial integration in the States. We see Bonhoeffer stand for the love of God as a complicated task of social engagement. And this is something that allows him to wrestle publicly in his letters, but also to do so in ways that I think profoundly, and I even say prophetically, speak to some of our own current situations. So last time I read cover to cover letters and papers from prison, I did this in 2020 while the COVID pandemic was kind of at its height of terror. And the whole book was almost speaking directly to what I was going through, what we all were going through. Death is everywhere. How do we navigate when things are no longer normal? What does it mean to love God when the church seems to be sort of eviscerated of the commitment to the Jesus that you try to embody in the world? All of these questions, I know no one who is as profoundly contemporary as Bonhoeffer to where we are today. And so most of his work is, I think, best understood as a record of someone coming to grips with the complexity of living without moral clarity and yet with Christological centrality, right? Standing for who Christ is in a space that requires us to struggle. And I find that way more compelling, for what it's worth, than a lot of the contemporary Christian ethics that people would articulate today, where it ends up being, here's the 5 principles, here's how you do it, here's how you make things look like the God's kingdom. Bonhoeffer repeatedly will say, we have to get away from these kind of guiding principles and cling to what then is God's will for me today. And that might look different than God's will for someone else. And it might look different than God's will for me tomorrow. And that play, that ambiguity, to quote Simone de Beauvoir, is something I think that more Christians need to appropriate, because it is a more sustainable vision of moral life. It's embodied, right? It's profoundly vulnerable. And that's something very different than a lot of what you will see today. Now, last thought, in order to make sense of Bonhoeffer, and this is a non-controversial statement within Bonhoeffer scholarship, a very controversial statement within evangelical readership. There are lots of good books on Bonhoeffer. The best biography on Bonhoeffer for me is written by his closest friend, Ebthard Bethge. Fantastic book. Bethge also edited Ethics and Letters and Papers from Prison. Like he's responsible for a lot of the later Bonhoeffer we have access to. Bethge brought together, pulled these writings. A lot of the letters were written to Bethge. Huge biography on Bonhoeffer. It's amazing. A horrible biography on Bonhoeffer is written by Eric Metaxas. And yet it is hands down the book that will pop whenever you Google Bonhoeffer, because it is a bestseller. It is written, though, and this is why it's awful, it is written to make Bonhoeffer look like a hero of contemporary American evangelical Christianity. Bonhoeffer would oppose almost all of that, right? Absolutely opposed anything that looked like a kind of nationalistic frame, opposed everything having to do with the kind of complacency of the political manifestations we see in at least American evangelicalism, and especially would have opposed the arrogance that is deployed regarding moral clarity about what it looks like to, apply God's answer book to the problems of the world. Bonhoeffer wanted nothing to do with any of that. He explicitly says the Bible doesn't work as a kind of point-by-point answer book for the problems of the world. The Bible is there to invite us to be truthful in our living, which may or may not require us to have to, be morally more complicated in a world that is broken and flawed and dangerous, and in the case of Hitler, profoundly evil. So in some ways, and here, make sure everyone watching, the views of the guest do not reflect necessarily the views of the interviewer. So I'm going to say something that I think is true. It does not necessarily reflect where Josh lands. I think Metaxas's Bonhoeffer is especially corrupted, given Metaxas's profoundly problematic loyalty and unquestioned, I would suggest, idolatry relative to Donald Trump over the past several years. And in many ways, and I'm not suggesting Trump is Hitler, I am suggesting the loyalty of American evangelicals to Trump can mirror the problematic loyalty of the church to a state manifestation of power that Bonhoeffer opposes. And so again, for us to take seriously Bonhoeffer's life and legacy and the work that he offers to us as philosophers, theologians, ethicists, and humans, we've got to oppose this evangelical appropriation of Bonhoeffer as a kind of conservative Christian hero. He simply was not. And as far as I'm concerned, and I've written some essays about this. In fact, I'll send you, Josh, a link to one that you can stick in the description. It's an open access essay simply called Militant Liturgies. And it's about how Kierkegaard, King, Bonhoeffer, and Simone Weil represent a militancy in response to the complacency of their Christian communities. And this is something that I think, again, for someone like Metaxas, who is the model of complacency to a kind of conservative hegemony, that would be something Bonhoeffer would see as not only idolatrous, but profoundly immoral. So again, that's a controversial statement for evangelicals, not for Bonhoeffer scholars who widely panned the book And yet anywhere you go, that's the one that I fear people would go grab because it's got all the press, all the push. It's the top hit on Amazon. And I want to make sure to encourage people to move away from it.
That's a really good introduction to who Bonhoeffer is, and you've opened so many different discussions and sub-themes that we will be discussing over the rest of this interview. But perhaps the first one, which is perhaps also most applicable to maybe viewers of this channel and the modern world, is our approach to ethnic minorities and the oppressed, because in some sense it's been around 100 years since World War II and the events of Bonhoeffer's life, but nonetheless we still struggle with a lot of these challenges of ethnic minorities struggling in states and all around the world. And as a result, I suppose, what would be Bonhoeffer's approach, perhaps speaking more specifically to the individual lives of the oppressed in relationship to structures of power? How do we navigate that in a Christian way, in a Bonhoefferian, or if that's the way to put it, way?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I'm so glad you ask it, because for present cultural reasons, there has been a rise of anti-Semitism, especially in the States, again, largely fueled by complicated dynamics at the both political and cultural and economic and racial levels. And so part of what I want to suggest is we should, with Bonhoeffer, see anti-Semitism in all of its forms as radically evil. And it's important, there's actually some scholars that talk about this, that although a kind of cultural anti-Semitism can go all the way back to Luther in the very particular German context that Bonhoeffer inherits, right, as a pastor there, it's important to understand, like, even for Luther, it just didn't have necessarily the same racial connotation. It was more this kind of religious commitment to being still deeply problematic, I would suggest deeply wrong, but this idea of a kind of Christian exclusivism that led him then to be opposed to a Jewish account, right? But without in any sense trying to justify Luther's error on this, nonetheless, what we see in World War II, what we see in Nazism, both then and even now in neo-Nazism and white supremacy, is an anti-Semitism that then has this absolutely horrifying and ugly racial dynamic. And that Bonhoeffer is unambiguously opposed to any version of racism. Again, anchor his resistance to anti-Semitism in Germany in his experience of seeing Black triumph in the context of American social histories, right there at Abyssinian. And in many ways, Bonhoeffer, I think, in maybe to quote James Cone, is looking for hope beyond tragedy. And he sees this hope beyond tragedy in the emotive, affective worship and music even of the Black church in America. And similarly then finds that in, the beauty of Jewish resistance to the hatred being displayed and being made normative, being made okay, right? Famously, Kristallnacht, where you have the night where Jewish businesses and temples and are destroyed all across the country, following on this basically protest or ban of boycotting. They're boycotting Jewish offices, Jewish employers, Jewish businesses. All of this is stuff that Bonhoeffer absolutely speaks out against. And in fact, there is a story where Bonhoeffer is profoundly repentant, and it has to do with he was invited to preach the father of one of his family members' funerals. It was basically like brother-in-law's dad was Jewish and he dies, and Bonhoeffer's invited to preach the funeral, and he refuses or passes. He doesn't say absolutely no, but he doesn't do it because of this kind of cultural anti-Semitism. He doesn't want to get caught up in this. And later he apologizes and says, look, I was wrong. Please forgive me. We must stand with the oppressed. And so if you take seriously Bonhoeffer's commitment to stand with the oppressed as unbelievably consistent as a biblical principle, right? From the Old Testament through the New Testament, what we find is a story of God constantly on the side of the poor, the oppressed, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the marginalized, the downtrodden, right? This is a story of God's being where those people are, where the least of these are. So that as the frame and the context, well, what do we then do in a contemporary situation where it might be the case that Israel as a nation state, as a governmental power is engaging in, we might say, oppressive behavior to other peoples that are similarly marginalized and without power, right? How is it that we can make sense of this? And this is not suggesting this is what Bonhoeffer would think. I do think this is a consistent reading of Bonhoeffer's encouragement to us to make the most of God's will where we find ourselves. I think Bonhoeffer would say, never confuse the social structure and power with the people who are named by that power. So what I mean by that is, notice he's standing against the church in the name of something like Christianity, right? And even later in Letters and Papers from Prison, he has this great line where he says, I don't use the word God around religious people because what they mean by God is not what I mean by God. It's just too complicated a word. He says that we must seek a religionless Christianity. Well, this is his version. This is his version of trying to, again, like drive a wedge between the institutional power structure and the community that operates often under the same name. And this is what we see in Kierkegaard, again, bringing Christianity to Christendom. It's what we see in King, bringing the beloved community to the very churches engaged in racist behavior. So I think a Bonhoefferian view is, how do you stand with whoever the oppressed and marginalized and unempowered are? And how do you stand against power that confuses statecraft and hegemony and ideological frames for a people's identity? Now, I say this not suggesting that I understand the finer points of, complicated Jewish legacies and relationships to the state of Israel. I am not suggesting any kind of anti-Israeli claim here. I am suggesting, at our peril, we would ignore the plight of, those suffering in Gaza at the hands of state power. Whatever that looks like, Bonhoeffer, I think, will always stand with the powerless. That does not mean, however, that then he would justify anti-Semitism. He would say, no, that's not only a non sequitur, but it is now a new evil, right? So we must oppose anti-Semitism in all its forms, says Emmanuel Levinas, which is any manifestation where we hate the other person. And that's where I tend to read Bonhoeffer toward that Levinasian sentiment. How are we standing for the oppressed in light of the workings of power that so often need another to oppress in order to justify its own status? How can we stand with the marginalized and not slide into the confusion whereby something like anti-Semitism would then be justified in the name of standing with the marginal, right? We must oppose anti-Semitism, and we must oppose power being deployed to make the most vulnerable even more vulnerable. And for me, that's where I see Bonhoeffer's experiences in the Black church there in New York City, his experiences navigating World War II and the Nazification of Germany, and his experience standing up against the very Christian church that he was part of. and having to stand differently in order to represent what he took God's will to look like. So from where I stand, and this again is Bonhoefferian, but not Bonhoeffer, I think we can both say that the actions going on right now in Gaza are not badly described as near genocidal, if not genocide, and yet condemn all anti-Semitism wherever it is found. Like both of those are consistent moral claims. And that's, I think, what Bonhoeffer would invite us into, along with, like I say, the Jewish Emmanuel Levinas, who says all anti-Semitism is the same. It's hatred of the other man. And that's the thing Bonhoeffer will oppose. That's a long answer. I'm trying to be nuanced. Yes. I hope that was nuanced enough. Like this is a fraught conversation for sure.
Of course. And I think that's exactly what we need to do as philosophers and philosophers of religion, is to really navigate these waters in a nuanced and a really precise way. And perhaps flipping, I suppose, this question to its other side, we've talked about how we need to stand with oppressed. Now, I guess it's still quite an abstract sentence. We know, I suppose, slightly how Bonhoeffer criticized and was in relationship to the Nazi regime of his time. Are there any ways in which we could find perhaps a Bonhoefferian system of standing up to the oppressed, and how could that perhaps translate to the modern context in which we are living in today, and how can we use that as a model for us to reflect on?
Yeah, I mean, so Bonhoeffer is helpful, and this is the influence of Barth on his thinking. Bonhoeffer is helpfully Christocentric from start to finish, right? And this is important because you just aren't going to see Bonhoeffer say, oh, so what it looks like to be Christian is to be part of this other political party, right? What it is to be Christian is to hold this view of social governance. That just doesn't show up in Bonhoeffer. What he, in fact, will say in Ethics, there's a whole section where he says, so what would the best possible state probably look like in light of our Christian commitments? And the answers he gives are these really abstract kinds of things. He doesn't say people will vote for, Joe Biden over Donald Trump. He doesn't say, oh, well, we will hold this position on Brexit, or we'll hold this position on, whatever independence. All of those things for Bonhoeffer are missing the fundamental point, which is, what do you take God's will to be for you where you are? And he will say, which I think is so cool, he says at one point, we've got to lean hard back into the Old Testament. And he at one point even says that it's deeply problematic for us just to run into the New Testament and think we have Christianity figured out. Now, there's lots of things we can draw from that. But for me, if we spend a little bit more time in the Minor Prophets, again, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a Christian ethicist, particularly, but what we see in the Minor Prophets is, let justice roll down like waters. I don't want, the praise and worship songs. I want you to live lives devoted to the other. What we see is a radical investment in not being immune or detached from the difficulties of social life, right? What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? It means, says Bonhoeffer, to love God. Like for him, these are two sides of the same coin. It's very Kierkegaardian for what it's worth. God is the middle term for Bonhoeffer, as for Kierkegaard, when it comes to loving your neighbor. So this is all to say, we must never try to use Bonhoeffer to our particular vision of political ends when it comes to, therefore, you should align with this or that group. What I think he does offer us is a lot of resources for what are the kinds of values that should be guiding our social engagement. And that's what we've talked about. The oppressed, the poor, the marginal. Are we standing with those with whom God and Jesus stand, right? But also, he gives us some really good warnings about things to stand against. Power structures that think they can claim God as on their team, right? In some sort of, again, idolatrous way. So for me, Bonhoeffer gives us really good resources for opposing all Christian or so-called Christian nationalisms, wherever the nation might show that. Christian nationalism is a not only misnomer, it is by definition antithetical to the God that Bonhoeffer articulates. So Christian nationalism's out, which now if we start there, that's going to start opening some doors to, and this is again in my context, right here in the American context today, I think the widespread American white evangelical embrace of a man who does not model other-oriented love and radical humility as a guide for his public life, I see that as deeply problematic. And yet others might say back, well, wait a minute. So you support people who, are affirming other immoral things to their minds. I've got plenty of friends, right, who will say that I'm wrong because I actually support reproductive rights, and also because I am fully affirming when it comes to LGBTQ, Christian brothers and sisters, right? Like they'll say you're entirely out of line. Okay, but notice the claim here is not, hey, y'all should support this guy, right? The claim is, are we modeling love? What does that look like? Are we willing to put ourselves in question? Are we with Bonhoeffer to say, I know what I must do, and yet I cannot do so in security, right? I pray God forgive me, right? Like that kind of hospitality and humility are the things that far too often I do not see displayed by those who think that their Christian commitments can play out as a political program of loyalty to a particular social leader. Bonhoeffer warns us against such problematic loyalties. And again, I keep using this word. I would say it's a kind of idolatrous distortion of the costly grace that Bonhoeffer says Christianity demands, right? And unfortunately, any attempt to gain power as a mode of furthering Christ in the world is something Bonhoeffer is going to think is highly suspicious, right? And this is because, again, you read his stuff, Kierkegaard's the same way, and it's Christ with the lowliest. It's rarely Christ with the emperor, right? Which is not to say that God's not there too, or that person can't be wrestling also in those positions. It is, however, a thing where in philosophical ethics, we could sometimes call this a kind of moral preference for the poor, right? A disposition towards the marginal as typically having the burden of proof like in their favor, right? And I think Bonhoeffer does something very similar in that regard. So I don't know if that answers your question, but Bonhoeffer speaks to us by saying, here are some general guidelines, and those guidelines, again, are not going to be duties that are rationally circumscribed in a kind of Kantian moral framework, but they are profoundly humbling. And so if you are humbled by the humbling realities of what it looks like to try to live with God in the world, you are probably going to find yourself at odds with lots of the power structures that are confusing their will with God's will. And that's where I think in American evangelical circles, the Christian nationalist thread that is certainly in line with Trumpism, I would see as not only antithetical to Bonhoeffer, but even for me as a Christian, I see it as deeply, deeply anti-Christian, despite all the God talk. And that, again, makes me resonate with Bonhoeffer, where he says, I find myself not missing going to church. He says this in prison. He's like, and this is the guy who wrote, Sanctorum Communio, right? Like, this is the guy who wrote Life Together. And he says, I don't miss going to church because that became just another power structure and political entity. It's an institution. The church is the relational commitment to be God in the world, right? To navigate where we are in ways that are profoundly invested in the costly grace and walking, as he says early in his career, walking with Christ to the cross. That is not going to be something that is easily had because of Supreme Court victories and narcissistic political leaders who deploy the Bible for their own ends. That's something I think Bonhoeffer is going to definitely warn us against.
That's a very good summary of it. And over this interview so far, you've raised a lot of, I suppose, references to other thinkers, and perhaps someone watching this might be questioning, well, okay, what were Bonhoeffer's major influences? Is it some of his contemporaries like Barth and Niebuhr, or is it even going further back to people like Kierkegaard, Levinas, and others? What are some of the ideas, I suppose, influencing Bonhoeffer?
Yeah, I mean, I think theologically, Barth is pretty clearly the most influential on Bonhoeffer's early theological development. Later, I would say Niebuhr shows up significantly more in, again, the ambiguity that Bonhoeffer brings to moral questions towards the end of his life. And again, the guy he died at 39, which is staggering, right? So yeah. I'm almost 47. I mean, like the idea that I've had 10 more years than Bonhoeffer, and I still feel like a goon who's trying to figure stuff out. And yet this guy lived a life that like I'm still trying to aspire to, kind of even emulate in little minuscule ways. So it's important to understand, like, yes, he had these big influences, but part of what was so unique about him, and his contemporaries saw this early on, he was such an original thinker. He was entrancing as a speaker. Like people would hear him speak and just like, want to be part of whatever he was leading, right? Like he had this power to him. And so Barth, early on, Niebuhr more later, there is, again, in some of his work, a kind of deeply existential thread. It makes sense that he would have, again, he's a German intellectual coming through the spaces. I mean, he's a contemporary of Heidegger, right? He's a contemporary of, these other thinkers that are kind of in that early phenomenological and early existential space. So it makes sense that thought would kind of be just in the air. So you won't see him like citing these thinkers a ton, but you do see like there's a passage in Ethics, I think it is, it might be Letters and Papers, but where he's talking about idle chatter. Well, this is basically the term that we find Heidegger develop in Being in Time about idle talk, which would have been, in 26, 27. So, it's clear that he had a deep affinity with and familiarity with the kind of German intellectual philosophical movements that were occurring. We do see him talk quite a bit about Kant. Because again, he opposes this kind of Kantian rationalistic moral duty theory. As one scholar puts it, Bonhoeffer, unlike almost every other Christian ethics thinker, doesn't say, so what is the good? Bonhoeffer says, so what is God's will for me? And that, for me, looks an awful lot like Kierkegaard, right? In the way that we see him cash this out. For what it's worth, Kierkegaard, who was writing in the first half of the 19th century, 1813 to 1855, Kierkegaard has already made the distinction between cheap and costly grace. He works this out in a book called Practicing Christianity. So it's clear that some of that is influencing, big categories that Bonhoeffer then gets credited with developing. And I say that not like in a plagiaristic way, but these influences are kind of subtle streams. But this guy was a voracious reader, and so it made sense that he would have kind of taken it all in and then pushed it out as original thought, right? I do not know if there was any interaction between he and Levinas. I can't imagine that there would have been. And the reason for that is just because Levinas really doesn't kind of show up on the scene really until after World War II. He did publish a book before World War II in the early 30s, but it didn't make a ton of a splash. And then his next big book was in 1947, which is written largely while in a prisoner of war camp. So I would say more Barth, Niebuhr, and then the existential and phenomenological traditions are kind of the philosophical spaces, but of course, drawing on German thinkers like Kant and Hegel, who are kind of always right there in the background, either as interlocutors critically or more affirmatively.
Yeah, that's definitely very helpful to, I suppose, frame Bonhoeffer in his time. Perhaps turning to his more theological views, I suppose, what's perhaps his relationship, you raised a bit, with the confessing church and Lutheranism of the time. I suppose the Lutheranism of Germany at the time is probably quite different from Luther's original conceptions of Christianity.
Right.
But nonetheless, what are, I suppose, his relationships with Luther's Christianity, but also, I suppose, the Lutheranism of the time?
Yeah, I mean, so again, I'm not a theologian, so I'll answer this to the best of my ability as a philosopher. So the themes that one finds in Bonhoeffer that I think are certainly Lutheran. We've already talked about how, in some ways, Bonhoeffer opposed the kind of cultural anti-Semitism that was anchored in some of Luther's kind of anti-Jewish religiosity, right? And these traditions Bonhoeffer certainly opposed. So Bonhoeffer, importantly, did not have a kind of deferential, honorific vision of, these church leaders. They are helpful insofar as they're right, not because, oh, well, they held that position, therefore they are right. And this is consistent with Bonhoeffer's general opposition to power structures being more important than the lived practice of, Christian existence. So, I highlight three things I think are key theological insights of Bonhoeffer that certainly have Lutheran inheritance, though he pushes them in different ways. First, Bonhoeffer definitely moves away from a radical individualism that is certainly thematically coherent in lots of German Protestantism. So early on, we do see, again, in Bonhoeffer, moments where like costly grace as opposed to cheap grace. This is certainly about, am I willing to inhabit and receive the grace of God that would require me to walk this difficult road? There is that, again, individual sense of, by faith and grace alone. But differently, this is something that we never get costly grace or embrace costly grace by ourselves. We do this in the context of a community. And that's where we, again, get the Sanctorum Communio from the very outset, life together, all the way through ethics, which is about how do we inhabit our social and political and structural spaces as part of this thing called the body of Christ in the world. So this communitarian sense of sola fides, you might say, I think is really, really profound in Bonhoeffer. Secondly, we do see in Bonhoeffer a Christocentric theology, which I've talked about coming largely from Barth. And in fact, his early opposition to Niebuhr was grounded in this. He was worried about Niebuhr being so socially activist that it was missing the, yes, but who is God? Who is Christ? But later on, Bonhoeffer, in his late work, will say, what is the church's word for the world today? And his answer is what it's always been, right? Christ. That's the word, full stop. And now we could then start saying, well, wait a minute, but who's Christ? Is it Metaxas's Christ? Is it, God forbid, Trump's Christ? Like, who's Christ? Bonhoeffer wants again to say, well, it's the Christ who is maximally revealed as expressing the Sermon on the Mount as not just big overall duties, but as the kind of life to which we are called, right? Are we meek? Are we peacemakers? Are these things being put in practice? If the church is not expressing that, the church is not expressing Christ to the world, right? And then third, so we've got the kind of like communitarian sense of sola fides, right? We also have this radical Christocentric conception. But then third, I think that part of what we see in Bonhoeffer is a real sense And depending on, which Lutheran scholar you talk to, a real sense of this radical humility. And I tend to think that you see some of that in Luther early on. We see far less of it in Luther later on. And so, again, I'm not a Luther scholar, but it does seem to me that when Luther moves more and more and more and more into his kind of anti-Jewish sentiments, into his much more kind of persecuted sense of the truth that he's standing for, we lose some of that humility that says it's precisely because I'm anchored in a Christocentric theology, as nested in a community of faith where my brothers and sisters are always helping each other not, give into the temptations of power and selfishness and egoism. I think that we find in Bonhoeffer just such a humble model of what it looks like to walk in confidence, but not in certainty. And for me, that's really profound, because as a philosopher who's a postmodernist, I take really seriously the idea that I can claim that P is true and try to enact P as a way of life while recognizing really good reasons for people to disagree with P. And that is something I just don't see enough, whatever one's political identity, I don't see that enough within Christian spaces. We just don't see in Bonhoeffer a lot of sympathy for what we would now call the kind of like modern apologetics, right? This I can beat you in argument and get the audience on my side, and we'll show you why all of the objections fail, and therefore there's a God. You just don't see Bonhoeffer doing that stuff. What you see Bonhoeffer doing is saying death is everywhere. The rule book's been thrown out. How then will I stand for who Christ is today? Right? We see this, God help me kind of a thing. And one of my favorite examples of this, and this is where I'll summarize the both Lutheran appropriation and opposition. So when he writes to, I think it was to Niebuhr, may have been to Barth, but I think it was to Niebuhr, this letter where he's basically explaining why he's got to go back to Germany. And he says, I know this is what I must do, but I can't do it in security. He also has this line, which has just haunted me. And I quote this in the end of my book, God and the Other. And I turn to Bonhoeffer as actually an example of what I call a ethico-political exemplar, or a postmodern saint. And what I mean by that is somebody who gives their entire life to the other, and yet does this without some sort of moral certitude that then allows them to be self-aggrandizing, right? How can you both stand with confidence and yet lack that kind of certainty? That seems fascinating to me, and yet I think we see this in Bonhoeffer. And he says in this letter, we must remember that we can always do otherwise. Now, this is a direct challenge to Luther, right? Who says, here I stand, I can do no other, right? There's nowhere else I can stand. I stand with certainty. We see in Bonhoeffer, I could always stand otherwise. And it might be that I should, but I can't. Like, here's where I find myself. I'm doing the best I can. I get why others might choose differently. And he doesn't condemn them. Now, he condemns, those siding with Hitler, right? But others might have stayed in New York and say, no, this is where I can be the most help. But for Bonhoeffer, he finds this passage in the Bible where it says, those who believe do not flee. And he says, shoot, I got to go back. So that idea of we can always do otherwise, I pound this into the heads of my students, not theologically, but epistemically. If we are responsible epistemic agents, we are people who care about believing truly and living truly, we must remember precious little is obvious, right? And unless we're willing to be critiqued, we should be very hesitant to engage in, claims that would call others to task. And Bonhoeffer does both. He not only stands and condemns Hitlerism, condemns those who side complacently with the Nazis. He also, though, will constantly reach out to his friends and say, am I missing something? I'm doing the best I can. What do we think? How do we make, he's also leaning back into that community. and saying, we've got to help each other. And so for me as a philosopher, I see this as a great example of what it looks like to have moral commitments guiding our actions and our life and our commitments, and yet a political sensibility that whatever those moral commitments look like when put into practice, we'd better be really careful not to confuse our view with the view. And that's why he sees God's will for me in different ways than what is God's will as the capital G good that can be articulated according to rational principles. That's just not the way he sees this playing out. And I find that unbelievably compelling for epistemic reasons.
Perhaps to tie all this interview back together, Bonhoeffer was a figure who wrestled with a lot of challenges of his time. He experienced a lot of sacrifice himself and also witnessed a lot of sacrifice around him. And of course, one of his main works, The Cost of Discipleship, is one of his most popular works as well. How would you perhaps summarize his ideas on sacrifice, what it means to be a Christian, and more importantly, what it means to be a human being in this world where sacrifice is of course all around us?
Yeah, I mean, so far too often, and again, I'm speaking from an American United States context, largely raised within white Pentecostal communities. So it's important again to realize that any attempt to talk about contemporary context is to realize there are a bunch of them, right? Your context at a student at Oxford in the UK, or a friend who is in Hong Kong but studying there and didn't go to Britain. Like, all of us have got overlapping contexts as part of the human race navigating our humanity and our shared global space, but also very different local spaces that then call to us differently, right? And I think the big thing, though, that Bonhoeffer does is at both levels. He says at the big human level, what it is to live Christianly is to be willing to let our vulnerability play out in ways that will almost always lead us down difficult paths. So if we think Christianity can be seamlessly interwoven into the workings of power, Bonhoeffer's very suspicious, right? So at this kind of global context level, our shared humanity, the cost of discipleship, costly grace is, are you standing with God in lowliness as concerned about and on the side of those who have been lost in the, kind of what Hegel will call the slaughter bench of history, right? On the other side, this very, very local sense, Bonhoeffer, though, also wants to make sure that we are aware of the fact that these broad human, realities of finitude and vulnerability are always going to play out as local tasks. So what then will I do in my sphere of influence? And that, I think, is a question that all of us have got to ask. And it's extremely hard because, again, in the kind of metaxis reading of Bonhoeffer, some people can read him and think, yes, I'm standing for this Bonhoefferian model of faith by, working with the power structure, being loyal to my church commitments, moving this direction. Again, maybe, but it seems to me that you've got to really turn a blind eye to a whole bunch in Bonhoeffer to be complacent and complicit in those ways. And so for me, what Bonhoeffer does is invites us to ask, and this is a question that shows up in Simone de Beauvoir, another ethicist, roughly contemporary, kind of course, lived much later. He didn't die in the war, but lived through World War II, a colleague of Sartre. Simone de Beauvoir has this great book called The Ambiguity of Ethics, where she says, we must ask daily, am I actively working for the liberation of all people? And I think Bonhoeffer would say, again, in much more theological language, am I moving as far as possible into God's will for my life today to help others experience the flourishing and the joy that, God promises more abundantly, right? And if we find ourselves over and over and over and over and over stripping away rights, condemning people, um, not being heartbroken over the reality, for example, of the risk of suicide for transgender youth, if we are not thinking deeply about the geopolitical dynamics that allow the whims of one person, in Russia to cause suffering on global scales. Like if we are not heartbroken for those who are broken, it seems to me that Bonhoeffer stands there, metaphorically calling out to us from his prison cell, saying, in the midst of absolute darkness, like, are you still finding a way here today to stand for the neighbor love that we are commanded to enact, right? And I just think far too often the complacency of our contemporary world has overridden that sense of calling. And so how can we put this in practice? Be more sure when you are challenging your own position and be less sure when your positions reinforce your own power. That seems like a fairly good principle, with a lot more theological language. But again, I'm not a theologian, but that's where I see Bonhoeffer coming down at the end of things.
That's a really brilliant answer, and perhaps a really good way to slowly summarize this interview. To end off this interview, what would be some books that you would recommend for people to interact with to learn more about Bonhoeffer? Of course, you talked a bit about the biographies at the start of this interview, but what are perhaps more of the secondary literature and also some of Bonhoeffer's original work?
Yeah, so when it comes to biography, it's huge. It's a slog, but man, is it good, and it's authoritative as one can possibly be. Eberhard Bethge's biography of Bonhoeffer, highly recommended. Bonhoeffer's own works. Cost of Discipleship is kind of where everybody tends to go. It makes sense. You get your, kind of big classical distinction between cheap and costly grace. There's a lot of mileage that you can get out of that. That's a dichotomy I develop in my own essay, the Militant Liturgies essay. It is the case, though, I think that if you want to understand Bonhoeffer in all of the ambiguity and complexity and humility that I've been trying to highlight, right? Again, as a philosopher reading his work, that's where I gravitate. I think Letters and Papers from Prison is just mind-blowingly good. It's just so powerful. Obviously, none of it was necessarily intended to be published in the form that it's in. He did mention to Bethge that he was working on a book, and some of Letters and Papers from Prison are some of that work that was hopefully going to become the book that he was kind of writing there in prison. Ethics is the other one that I'd highly recommend. Now, if you want to just sort of see a taste of all of his work, there's an excellent collection of his writings called A Testament to Freedom. And that one, I would say, is probably the best just single book collecting all of the stuff, the different parts from all of his different periods. Testament to Freedom is fantastic. As far as secondary work, I'm going to actually recommend two things. One, there's a book that I absolutely love, and sadly, I am blanking on the author's name right this second, but it's actually a book about Bonhoeffer and King, Martin Luther King. Highly recommended. It does a lot of work talking about Bonhoeffer and his relation to the Abyssinian Church, the way that this Black liberation theology and social justice work influenced his own theological upbringing, which again is super important in light of the fact that now you've got so many white evangelicals in America saying that if we talk about social justice, it's just, Christian heresy and wokeism. It's not the gospel. Bonhoeffer would find that a staggeringly bizarre claim, right? And he sees justice to be, again, flowing down like waters, what he enacted and saw there in New York, and then also what he tried to put in practice in his own life. And so book on Bonhoeffer and King, highly recommend. The other thing I'd recommend is a person. And she is brilliant, written several books, but also you can find her, just Google her. You can find sermons by her, and it's just Bonhoeffer in contemporary clothing, as far as I'm concerned. It's a woman named Jenny McBride, and she is a pastor, a rector, and I think she's in Atlanta currently, but she does amazing work in like Innocence Project activism, does wonderful work about like death row ministry, has a wonderful series of sermons that you can find on her website. If you just Google Jennifer McBride at comma Bonhoeffer, it'll pop right up. I've had the honor of hanging out with her at conferences, and she's brilliant. She's also the president of the International Bonhoeffer Society. And so she is one of the people who I would say, hey, if you want to see what a Bonhoefferian looks like as a voice today, I'd recommend Jenny's work. It's absolutely fantastic, and you'd be hard pressed to find better.
To end, and this is something I want to add on to these interviews about scholars and thinkers, is if you had to write an epitaph for Bonhoeffer, perhaps a 3-4-word epitaph, what would that be?
Wow. My goodness. So I do this practice with my students. There's a website that develops these and stuff, but it's just called 6-word memoirs. But you can think about them as epitaphs. Like what 6 words go on your tombstone, or what's your biography in 6 words? So I'll see if I can give a 6-word epitaph for Bonhoeffer. Maybe something like something like you can always do otherwise would be one, right? There's a 6-word, you can always do otherwise. That's 5 words. Shoot. You can always do otherwise today. Like we could add a 6th word or something, but I actually think that again gets at all this kind of ambiguity and humility that I've been trying to stress. I think you can also do one that basically says, do God's will where you are. That would be a 6-word memoir. I think that epitaph that would work for Bonhoeffer. And then maybe one, again, here's maybe a 6-word, but for me, just the beginning. Right. Which is his final words, but that's a great epitaph too, because it kind of summarizes the idea that he did not find his hope in social success, but in living a faithful life to do that which God models and calls us toward, right? This is what I describe in my book, Camping with Kierkegaard, as faithfulness as a way of life. I developed that as a non-religious idea, but it certainly can be a religious instance. And Bonhoeffer would be my example, as he is at the end of my book, God and the Other. Bonhoeffer is literally my example of, along with Corrie ten Boom and some others, but of what it looks like to live faithfully, working hard to bring about outcomes that are going to help people flourish, right? And prevent brutality and prevent violence and prevent suffering. But at the end of the day, the call, as Mother Teresa and Martin Luther King both understood, the call is not to be successful, to pull this off. Do what you can, tirelessly do what you can. But whatever the outcome, did you live the life that was faithful to that call? And I think that, but for me, only the beginning is a nice way to think about Bonhoeffer. Not, he's tragically killed by the Nazis, but he is also in many ways, he's, I always think about this like with Kierkegaard, right? Kierkegaard always wanted to be just a country pastor. He didn't want to do the big philosophy work that he did. He's like, I just want to go get married and have 2 kids and live in the country and preach and stuff. I think for Bonhoeffer, like, man, like that guy wanted to be a pastor, and, his fiance, like they never end up being able to get married. I mean, like, it seems to me that there is a life of being an old man that he would have thrived living toward, right? But in many ways, he was built for this. Like he knew in his early 20s, you don't talk about costly grace and say to follow Christ is to follow Christ to the cross. And wherever Christ leads, it always leads to death. You don't say stuff like that and then say, oh, but I'm going to go get, my 401k and stay out of trouble. He was a theologian built for the difficulty that his life then had to navigate. And I think what he does is invites us to build the resilience to be prepared for the difficulty that standing for Christianity, often against Christendom, might require.
Is there anything you want to tell us about what you're doing right now, or any of the ideas or projects you're working on?
Yeah, well, as always, I hope folks will pick up a copy of my recent book, if I can get it in the screen, Camping with Kierkegaard, Faithfulness as a Way of Life, available wherever books are sold. The Audible actually just came out a couple months ago. Really excited about that. And then also, I would highly recommend folks to check out my Substack, which is just called Philosophy in the Wild, or my YouTube channel, Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves. If they don't want to remember any of that, just go to my website, jaronsimmons.com, where there are links to all of the above. And there's also lots of other content there, public audience work I've done in other spaces, a bunch of open access academic essays that I've written, links to the various podcasts I've been on recently. And so jaronsimmons.com will get them to all those places, but especially Camping with Kierkegaard and my Substack are the two places I hope folks will connect with me so we can think together.
Brilliant. That sounds like a wonderful thing. I always get updates on Aaron's works on my LinkedIn and on my YouTube. So make sure you go check them out. I really do enjoy his YouTube channel. That's a brilliant summary of Bonhoeffer. I hope you really enjoyed this interview with Dr. Aaron Simmons. It's always a great fun and great joy to have him onto the channel. If you like this interview, you might also be interested in our interviews on Levinas and Kierkegaard. You could go check them out. I'll put them in the link below, in the description below as well. You can also check out all of Aaron's works in the platforms that he was talking about at the start of this interview in the description below. So make sure you go check his stuff out there. Also, if you would like to listen about any other thinkers or theologians, then let me know in the comments below. I'll also try to arrange more interviews with leading scholars on these topics. I do think it's really nice to be able to learn more about different things, different thinkers, and I do want to expand that part of this channel on here as well. So let me know your feedback and thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts there. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and God bless. I'll see you in the next video.